Well, good evening, everybody. Appreciate you, everybody, taking out the time. My son just tweaked my back, um, giving me a hug. So I'm in a little bit of pain that I wasn't in a few minutes ago. So I apologize to everybody for that. And I'll probably be wincing through it, and I might have to get up and walk around if the back starts to tighten up from what he just did. But that being said, it's a pleasure to be here with everybody tonight. Um, really wanted to make this as much as possible like a dialogue. And I think with the size of the group that we have, we can jump into that. So I was really only going to do a presentation, for about 15, 20 minutes maximum, and then just really open it up to dialogues and question and really just share, with all of you um, our thoughts and perspective on this question of a just transition, how and why we've come to some of the conclusions that we've come to, and what are some of our both, observations and reflections upon our experience. Try to implement one here, So with that said, look, just try to jump into it, and I'll try to talk. If I'm talking too fast, Hambone, just let me know. But to distract myself from a little bit of pain, I might speed it up. I have a tendency to do that. Um, so number one, I'm assuming everyone here has heard of this concept of a just transition. And if you haven't, just provide a little bit of history and background. Um, Number one, it's a concept which grew out of the labor movement, right? In the 1980s, like 1970s, 1980s, particularly folks who were in kind of the nuclear and the petrochemical industries, who were fighting against both deindustrialization. As we remember, that was a key component of the Reagan years, the real transition, to a post-industrial economy, offshoring, as people want to call it, and the real downsizing of much of, particularly the Midwest, but also many of the industrial areas up Y'all's Way, Hudson Valley Way, not too far away. A lot of the whole kind of Eastern Seaboard, and then shifting of that production capacity first down south, but then deeper down south, right to the global south. And as folks were being, those jobs and factories and everything were shutting down, it was two kind of components that folks were looking at, and kind of really coining this term and this phrase. And one was moving workers to other industries, particularly those who were, in their 30s and 40s and 50s, who still had some working years ahead of them and still were trying to take care of their families. But the other component of it was trying to move into industries that were not going to be destructive to the communities that they were embedded in, like the so-called frontline, front yard communities, most of which were, in Black and Brown and Indigenous communities where, these extractive facilities, these mines were, be it uranium or the oil fields of southern Louisiana, et cetera. And so not just to try to offer, kind of a transition and protection to the workers so that they can continue working, in fields that made decent wages, but to take care of the communities in which, these companies had did, by that point, decades and decades of just raw destruction, right? Think of Cancer Alley, down Bayou Way in Louisiana and parts of Texas. So folks were making a staunch pitch, against the forces of capital that control the industries that they were a part of, that they had kind of a duty and a responsibility to take care of these communities, to clean them up, revive them, and to take care of the workers that were in the industries. That's kind of the birth of the concept. Now, and that's the shorthand version. It's something that's grown, I would say, really in the last 15 to 20 years, like in the mid 90s, there wasn't much talk. Those of you who, were around and active at that time, I think a lot of us had been exposed to some of the early concepts, but there were other frameworks that were being used kind of at that time. Be it environmental racism and some of the critical movements of the early 90s. All the different things about that many folks were being involved in with trying to push for the Earth Summit stuff that came out of Rio in 1992, or the Kyoto Protocols, all those different things. Then there was a critical shift, like so many things after September 11th, where folks started to get a real good and clear taste that the United States in particular was leading the charge on not making any real bones about complying with what the international community was trying to move towards, and having kind of international standards to monitor global emissions, right? And they started playing with the dancing, around, well, the economy's too big, it's too complex, every excuse that they could come up with, right? And then by the time you got to Obama, there was kind of a Janus face real approach that we need to call out. On the one hand, as he said in his inauguration speech, the American way of life and American standard of living was not going to decline on his watch. He made that very painfully clear, which meant that all the different processes of exploitation and extraction were going to continue, but he was just going to come up with a nice way of talking about going green, or talking about going solar, or talking about the need for climate change without changing anything. And I'm saying all that to say that elements of the kind of progressive radical movement started picking up on this framework in the 2000s, but so did liberal forces. And as a result, there's a lot of confusion, I would argue, in the social movement right now about what a just transition is or possibly could mean. It's very contested. So in that contested space, our little ragtag, crew, our little ragtag army is try to, lay out a clear space of articulating what we think it should be and why. And we believe that we are arguing, for a transition to eco-socialism without hesitation, without any pause, is that is what we ultimately need to come to. And we're trying to be very clear with folks. We're not talking about a state-sponsored type of socialist orientation that will kind of define the socialist project of the 20th century. Not what we're talking about. We're not talking about one, much as what like the Soviet Union, really kind of anchored itself in China to a certain extent, the big catch-up paradigm, right? Of, which made some sense to the extent of if you didn't have the industrial capacity of, say, Great Britain or the United States or Japan, in the case of Russia, you were basically going to be annihilated. And many folks will remember that they got invaded, right after the revolution. And so the need to be able to match, their enemies bullet for bullet, gun for gun, tank for tank, plane for plane, wind up being kind of an existential piece for them, but it locked them into the same kind of cycles of a petrochemical, dependent kind of civilization, if you want to call it that, that their rivals were dependent upon. And that dynamic, if you look at it, still fundamentally hasn't changed. And we can talk about that a little bit later in many people's minds. But to be clear, that's not what we're talking about, because what that frames for many people, when we say this, people are thinking that we will have all the material goods and services that presently exist, we will just have them in a more cleaner way, a more sustainable way. And we would argue that if we're truly going to make a transition towards anything, oriented towards communal production, worker self-management, worker self-organization, community self-organization, that we won't be in a dynamic which is based upon the kind of the commodified set of relations and culture that we have all grown up in and accustomed to. It will not be this green. It will not be this solar. So we're trying to disavow folks of that notion when we are articulating a program around a just transition towards eco-socialism and say, no, it requires profound cultural shifts in terms of what we produce, why we produce it, why we consume it, do we need to consume it? So there's some deeper changes that we argue have to take place if we're going to be serious about, I would say sadly, just mitigating some of the worst dimensions of climate change. Because some things, folks, it's already baked in. There's a certain, at this point in these junctures, certain aspects of the multi already been put up in the atmosphere, and we're just talking about like carbon, emissions. But if you start adding on, some of the methane and some of the other stuff, which is rapidly, bubbling up in the Arctic and from the seas, there's some things that are already deeply baked into the system that we need to be very clear that we have to try to mitigate the worst kind of split-off effects. And that's going to require hard, immediate change, hard, immediate shifts, and shifts that are not mediated by techno fixes. And that's one of the reasons why we've been arguing, like, it's not just going to be a solar version of what already exists with all the existing kind of consumption habits and patterns, or trying to fulfill and extend those patterns, in other places. Even though we have to deal with the profound degree of just inequity in consumption in almost every dimension of life on this planet, between the imperialist cores or the global north, if you want to call that, in the third world or developing countries, or the global south, whatever framework you want to use, whatever language you want to use. Just the real difference that we see between how people live on this planet and who has what and who doesn't. And one critical dimension of that, which is often not that popular in certain kind of left circles, is a clear program that we believe has to accompany a just transition of degrowth, but a very strategic and a planned degrowth, one that has to be mediated in open democratic dialogue, with people in the global south, starting with folks whose islands, homelands are disappearing, in the Pacific, the Melanesian, Micronesian islands, etc. But there's also, severe lowland areas of Africa, Asia, Latin America, right here in Mississippi and Louisiana, which are disappearing right before our very eyes, and we have to be in some immediate conversation about, how are folks going to move, where are folks going to move, how are their culture and livelihoods going to be preserved in the cultural ways that come with it, because it's, in many of these places, it's indigenous folks who are being displaced and removed, from their ancestral homeland. So that's going to have to be a major question. But those are some fundamental things that any critical program trying to articulate a just transition has to answer. Like, what are we transitioning to? And we would argue, just thinking that you're going to have a basic element of a Green New Deal, which would have all of the different kind of contradictions that the New Deal itself has, if we don't clearly articulate who should benefit and why. And if folks don't know what I'm talking about, the New Deal largely excluded Black and Latino workers and where they were concentrated at that time, very intentionally and deliberately. So it excluded domestic workers who were primarily Black women and Latinas in the 1930s and 40s, and agricultural workers who were also primarily Black and Latino at that time, and excluded them from the so-called Social Security benefits. But that was a kind of the price of the deal, in particular within the Democratic Party coalition that existed then, to get certain kind of legislation passed. So they threw critical sections of the populations inside the United States under the bus. And I think if we look at how much of the framing of how the Green New Deal is being positioned now, indigenous communities and a lot of Black and frontline communities will also be thrown under the bus if there's not a radical reorientation of how this argument is both made and then how the policy struggles are going to play out. But for us, before putting a heavy emphasis on policy, there's some critical organizing and base building work that has to get done. And in that regard, we think, many of the folks who we rock with in different ways and perspectives in articulating both a just transition or trying to support and radicalize the Green New Deal, that they're kind of putting, the cart before the horse, in that we don't really have an established enough practice of autonomous, development in our communities that's really linked up in doing the type of production for community need that we think is going to be necessary for us to have the actual power to institute this from the ground up and then transform, the tougher dimensions of both the policy and where capital comes into play. We have to build our strength there and not expect something to be kind of mediated or granted to us from the top, because we know if that happens and they set in term and define the rules, again, certain folks are going to be left out of the program or excluded from it, and it will only wind up in the interest of being a mediated way to, have ExxonMobil come up with the latest new ways, or Elon Musk or something like that, coming up with the new creative ways to sell us the new cool techno fixes that they will then tout as the kind of the Green New Deal. So we have to build our capacity from below. And for us, we think there's a combination of doing deeper development work, as I'm sure many of you are doing, starting with the basic things that we could all do, and many of us are already doing, like our own, community gardens, but scaling that up in a broad, organized fashion so that we're actually building the capacity to have like food sovereignty in our communities, to be able to step out of the different type of market relations and commodity relations that exist around food, that then exist around land, that then exist around housing. All those different things go together, and to stage that up in our work. These are the critical things that we have. We say that the just transition piece has to be an organizing initiative and move from the grassroots up and out in order for it to be effective and have the impact and power shift that we ultimately need to have if we're going to get towards building eco-socialism from below. So I'm gonna stop there just because there's some pain and I need to stretch a little bit, Henry. But to open it up to all of you, just for some dialogue and some back and forth. But one thing before we get to that, I do want to mention, just so everybody knows, turn it back over to you just for a quick second, Henry, about the fundraising work that we wanted to talk about real quick before we get to the Q and answer. So I'm gonna pass it back on to you, and then let's get into some Q&A. That's the dialogue.
Ali, thank you. That's great. That's great history and an incitement to organize. Wicked. Yeah, so tonight is mostly all about education, and not just us getting educated, but us getting the materials to then turn around and educate other folks, right? Because we're organizers. But secondly, is a fundraiser for Kali and his family. They're about to make a transition, hopefully a just one, to Vermont. And it's for the Regeneration Corps, which is a just transition education and organizing program happening in high schools in Vermont right now. Folks from Building a Local Economy, Rural Vermont, Grassroots Center, community resilience organizations, am I going to remember everything? Grow More, Waste Less, Change the World Kids. I think that's it. Are all working together to, what? Oh, and Farm to Plate, right. Are all working together to organize kids for a regenerative agricultural movement based in the intersections of climate, racial justice, and creating a regenerative economy. And we're educating kids, and they're getting credits towards their diplomas. And we're hoping that we're going to be able to scale this up in a way, much in the way that Kali's talking about. Really not just doing it in a couple little schools and planting a couple trees, but escalating this into an alternative to regular industrial systematized learning and getting folks engaged in sorting out their future economy and the pressures that are coming down on them, starting with this frontline group, the teenagers of the state of Vermont. So if you want to help us out, please do. If you want to check us out, definitely do. We want to work with you in your communities and your schools. And thanks so much for that. So if folks have questions that they'd like to ask, y'all can throw them up in the chat, and either Kali will select from there, or maybe we'll call on you to actually voice your question, but to keep it from everybody bottlenecking in this online system, start on the chat. We'd love to hear what you think about or what you'd like to know about regarding the just transition and organizing. Kathleen, I know you're out there.
I was typing my question, but I'm kind of slow. I've been to Jackson a couple of times and really excited about Cooperation Jackson and what's happening there. And looking forward to meeting Kali, hopefully soon. And I wonder if you would talk a little bit more about Vermont, maybe, and what's happening with Mississippi and Cooperation Jackson, both economically and ecologically, and why you are interested in Vermont and what you see happening in Vermont that could either, be a collaborative process with what's happening in Jackson, or better meets the needs of your family, or just want to hear more about that.
Sure. Well, one of the things I didn't mention, and just figuring folks, most of the folks on the call were from Vermont, but a very critical thing that I would like to elicit a broader conversation, maybe join into one depending on where it's at. And that is, by every calculation that I've seen and studied, particularly like the last 10 years of, how the climate zones are shifting, all over the country. Large parts within the next 25 to 50 years, large parts of the southern United States, if there's not major infrastructure or a major shift in emissions, a large part of this is going to be underwater soon. And deeply salinated. And all of the rain patterns and shift patterns, of where crops will grow, whether it be the best kind of growing seasons, that's shifting up further north. And the environment where you all at will be less what you're accustomed to in about 5 to 10 years, and much more, what it is, say like in Maryland or things of that nature within the next kind of generation. Now, there's some profound implications of that. One, I think you all need to be prepared over the next, couple of years and decades for a profound population shift that's going to start heading up north. But before that happens, there's going to be some major land grabbing activity that's likely going to take place in and around Vermont, as particularly agribusiness and all the different things that are associated with it, and all the financial forces that come with it. They are already aware of this information and starting to look and head in that particular way, and it's going to skyrocket, prices, and make probably, large parts of the New England area, on par with the inflated value of properties, say in California, which might be good for a few homeowners, will be an utter disaster if there's no infrastructure built in for the vast majority of people to have, either affordable or decommodified housing. So that's something that's going to have to be built in. And another critical piece is that, like everywhere in the United States, is going to be a large influx of particularly folks from Latin America, Central America, the Caribbean, and throughout. And that's going to shift a lot of the cultural dynamics. You have folks from quote unquote different races coming in, moving in. So thinking about that, like trying to be what's the counter and think long term, like where would best be positioned for a movement of this nature. That is part of our thinking in calculus, right? Not just mine or not just those kind of immediately close to me, but just strategically looking at the organization. And we've been in some dialogue and will continue to be in dialogue with a number of different communities about how do we start to collaborate. So we're not in any form or fashion like abandoning Cooperation Jackson because it still has a lot of growth and development that it needs to get to. But extending our view and then just making some partnerships and transitions to kind of extend and build out the kind of value chains and supply chains and supportive relationships and networks that we think this movement, this transformative movement, needs, which really don't exist to the extent that they need to right now. Right. So that's part of what our effort, is, and we hope in many respects to be a bridge and a link and a kind of an advanced party to some of that work. Now, as for Cooperation Jackson itself, in a general sense, we're in a good place relative to what's going on with COVID-19. I mean, it is impacting us, as I'm sure it's impacting all of you. It's totally transformed, a lot of our operations. We're still nowhere near like full productive capacity. And we really, at this stage of the game, we don't see that really happening in 2021, with everybody trying to remain safe. We are definitely of the conclusion, that the vaccines in many respects are a false hope and a false confidence. I hate to be a downer to anyone, but in many respects, what we've seen, at least in our community, the rollout of it was terrible. Totally inequitable. Repeated a lot of the old standard racial fault lines that already exist in Mississippi and throughout the country. And even at the rate that they're going and trying to pick up now, all the calculations are to reach this kind of magical herd immunity, which I think is a totally false notion that they need to stop perpetrating. But they're saying at the rate that they're going now, even if they catch up with what Biden's talking about doing, you're talking about 7 years of us going through this to be able to catch up, right? Now, mind you, now I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I'm looking to be able to take one of the vaccines myself, because I do think the science to a degree for what they were trying to and aiming to do, and I'm a big science nerd, was pretty sound, but that does not mean what they have experienced on either of the three that will, one is about be the Johnson & Johnson was about to be approved probably this weekend. We don't have any long-term case studies on how this rolls out, and given the nature of coronaviruses, they mutate very rapidly, very fast, and we already know that you can get the flu over and over again, and I'm quite sure that's going to be the case for coronavirus for many years. Even with the vaccination, it'll probably shield many of us, and I stress many of us, not all of us, help many of us not die, and those who have like pre-existing conditions of which I'm one of those people that have asthma. So suspect in that particular way. So it may help with that, but it doesn't mean this won't become chronic. So we are playing it safe. All that to say that we've been playing it very safe and very slow and not trying to rush into a number of different things, and also trying to adjust, because another critical thing that I see personally happening is that the nature of work is going to profoundly change after this. I mean, Capital was making some major adjustments, like us using this damn Zoom thing. This is going to be one of the major. It's already one of the major tools that's a rearticulating work in this country. And it's not going to be a rearticulated for many of us for the better, because it comes with extra surveillance tools where they can monitor what keystrokes you're doing. They can, which already exists anyway. But for that to be embedded in many of the company software that many folks are going to have to do, we already know that the working hours for uh, um, most people, but for women in particular, has just gone up as folks are doing both extended childcare and labor at the same time. I mean, we're doing that. Y'all can probably hear my kids in the background. So we've been doing that and been trying to adjust to it, as best we can. And we know this is a multiplier effect where there are millions of people doing this. So we think our program is one that will, stand the test of time. A large part of Cooperation Jackson's program was really built, so folks know, was built on the basis of the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and recognizing that, two dimensions. One, the state in many places does not have the actual capacity anymore to actually deal with many of the social crises. I mean, what's going on now in Mississippi, I don't know, just to bring you up to speed since you asked, half the city here is still without adequate water pressure or running water as of right now, as of today, from the storm that just, this freakish storm that just came through, the southeastern part of the country. Now, we're not as bad as hit as Texas per se, but, most folks here have not, and particularly, my generation and younger, have not, lived without running water. And this is now many folks, half of the city, more than half of the city has been without running water. Many people have been without electricity for a week. And the city of Jackson really does not have the actual capacity, either financially or in terms of equipment on all the overhaul, to actually deal with this in a proper way. So it's just aggravating the crisis, and we see that being magnified in Louisiana and in Texas. So that's one, and that's a direct result of the evisceration of the state from neoliberalism from the last 40 years, 40 plus years. But the other piece is, it's also because of who's politically in control. They also don't have a particular interest or desire to deal with epidemiology and all these other kind of things. So we already kind of had a program which was very much trying to be articulated on, we have to do for self, because we don't expect aid or support to be coming. So we're hunkering in on that, but we're still learning the ins and outs. We were doing, by my reckoning, I think very well. The first 5 or 6 months, I think our crew was very disciplined. We had figured out enough of a formula to kind of get back to some of our operations for a bit, with people's assemblies and things of that nature that we were doing. And then I think, like many people, we got tired and we got sloppy. And 6 of our members in November and December wound up catching COVID. Fortunately enough, 4 of those 6, it was, they had to do the quarantine, but they didn't have any major problems, but 2 did. And they're still living, with the long-term effects of it. And one of our members, her partner, almost died, was intubated for about 3 weeks, and luckily came out of it. So based on all this, we've been going very slow, and this last, month and a half, we've really just been focusing on doing another round of internal education and training to try to skill ourselves up and do some education, while there's some time to do it. And then we're going to kind of reassess a number of different things in April that builds our overall, capacity for the long haul. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thanks for that, Khalid. There's a couple more questions on Stack. I know at least one of them has to do with seizing the potentially radical moment and turning things around. Before we go there, I want to ask you, so here we are in Vermont, reading about the just transition, reading about some of the science about how to try to turn around climate change. It looks like for Vermont, a regenerative economy is definitely going to be based in agriculture. And in order to bring that up to scale and to address that organizing problem, it's looking like land stewardship. So I'm just trying to represent some of the youth that I work with, because they have been coming to me saying, hey, here's this pandemic and it's threatening the lives of mostly people a lot older than us, but much more ubiquitously, the climate disaster is threatening every life that's ever going to be after this generation that is being threatened by the pandemic right now. So just to follow up on what you were saying a little bit ago, how can organizing and education around the just transition help us help Vermont to create a regenerative economy? What are the kind of organizing opportunities that you think we might be able to get a hold of here?
Well, I've been doing my homework, but I would still say it's far from complete. That's going to take some years to do. But a couple of things that kind of immediately spring to mind to me. I think this question of land stewardship is going to be pivotal. And there's two dimensions of that, which to me, I haven't seen a lot of literature on, but that may be what I'm looking at. So correct me. But one dimension of it that I haven't seen a whole bunch is like really trying to restore the the critical zones of just habitat restoration, right, and reserving a large part of that for that. Because there seems to be one set of literature dynamic of like, well, we need more farmers, we need to expand farmers. And while I think that's true, I think there's an orientation to that, which is, we need to maximize land use, right? And make every inch, if possible, do it in the old monocrop method of farming and agriculture, right? Some of the stuff that I've seen is very oriented at even using some of this language. And I'm saying, well, pump the brakes on that. That's actually the wrong thing to do. Because if we don't increase overall flora and fauna, we'll deplete our soils, we'll be even in a worse condition 10 or 15 years from now by multiplying the number of farmers, who aren't using permaculture or agroecology, those type of methods to actually restore the environment and be good long-term stewards to it, which has to do with changing a lot of the way, we farm and what we farm for, particularly understanding that there's some climatic shifts, which means that some things are going to shift. There's going to be new species coming up, which, in the short term would be invasive species, but in maybe like in the long term, you talk about like 50 years, will be endemic to the area, right? And so how do you live with them? How do you adjust when you haven't lived with them before, but they're just spreading with the natural environment. So that's a key piece that I think I've seen missed, that I think we need to also adjust to, in that, in a very particular way as it relates to kind of land stewardship. The other piece is the fight now to decommodify as much land as possible, I think needs to be front and center, right? Creating as many kind of community land trusts, collective holdings as can be, be constructed. And that, I think, is going to be one of the most fundamental building blocks, towards enabling a radical transformation, a radical just transition, program or anywhere really. But that's why I was trying to hammer home, like the real estate values from New York and up are going to increase up in that way as folks start to understand the value of what's there. That's just going to speculate. So, a big part of our program around Jackson, we have a fairly decent sized community land trust that we built over the last 7 years, and we prioritize that. And one of the reasons why we've been able to amass that, because we got in at the tail end of when a lot of the real estate in Jackson was cheap, because it's been dilapidated and abandoned, for like the past 30 something years. So we got in right at the right time. And oddly enough, through some of our own efforts, we've increased the value of it, and the speculation is just starting to go crazy here, right? In part just because the little things our farms did, or little things we fixed up here and there, but also not just solely because of us. You got a university which is trying to gobble up and expand as it's transitioning from being a historic Black college and university to a urban college. What they're trying to do now. Amazon is coming in, and Apple and a bunch of tech companies look like they're about to come in, swoop into place, and try to exploit, particularly the Black labor here. And this is part of an ongoing shift that they've been making basically since the crash of 2008, because I think they finally realized in their own the ill effects of their own racism to a degree, in that because they didn't spend money or resources kind of developing the skills that they needed, inside of the U.S., and it was much cheaper and easier to import, the brain drain and the brilliance of places like, India or Korea for a generation or two. When the crash hit, many of those folks, those brilliant minds, went back home to India, back home to Korea, and other folks, and setting up rival companies now. And so now you see this big program with like Apple and all these folks, where they just finally have discovered, all these hundreds of Black colleges and universities throughout the South, and trying to come in and appear to be doing this major investment, but really are just trying to create and cultivate another cheap labor source to do their programming and do their bidding, basically. So Jackson is now kind of caught in that crosshairs, and it's something that the force is here, that we're alive with. We see we're going to be, in a generational fight with them, for them to not redefine this project so completely as to wipe the radical kind of Black political project off the map. So that's a critical piece of something we're going to have to look forward to. But I cite that because it's not the same dynamic, but I think there are some dynamics from our experience trying this, where we may be a few years ahead, that we can kind of chart like, yeah, this for sure is going to happen, right? Because, like land in particular is one of those things, but then the capitalist framework, it typically does not depreciate, even if it's selling and spoiled and toxic. If it's in the right place, in the right mix, that it doesn't depreciate, right? It's going to appreciate, and that appreciation often means an exclusion of working class forces in like peasant forces in different countries. So we need to get ahead of that, I think, to the greatest extent possible. I know some of that is happening in Vermont, but if the movement can give that particular focus and attention to scale it up, and to strengthen its ties and to build it up, I know that I'm forgetting the name of it, but the sister who you introduced me to,
Every town.
yeah, so I think that's a critical effort that needs to be uplifted, supported, and fought for in the here and now, on a very strategic basis, to enable, the things we want to see happen 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road.
Yeah, just to back up what Kali's saying, he's talking about Kenya Lazuli and the Every Town Project, which is trying to get land donated in every town in Vermont into BIPOC land stewardship. And that will be held by the Northeast Farmers of Color Land Trust. And there is a regenerative agricultural mandate for that land. So that is a front, no matter what your ethical orientation is around anti-racism, et cetera, around a regenerative economy. That is Kenya and the Everytown Project organizing for land stewardship under a trust in every town in Vermont, and might be the hottest new project in the state right now, as far as I want to, Gwen's been waiting for a while. Good old Gwen. So we got Gwen, and then we got Brian, and then we got Trevor. We'd love to hear from everybody. And then we'll get back to Kathleen again. It's always a pleasure. Go ahead, Gwen.
Hey, Kali. I'm really excited about you moving to Vermont, because we could use your help, and I'm so inspired by your vision. So I want to remind people that in the chat, if you scroll up a bit, there's a place you can donate to help that happen. And we're working hard to raise the money to give you and your family a really good welcome to Vermont. In that respect, I'd like to just go back to your comments. And I noticed that you were interested in some schools of thought, the eco-socialists and the degrowth groups in particular. And one of the things that eco-socialists bring to mind, of course, is revolution. I'm really interested in getting revolutionary momentum behind what we're talking about with both reparations and regeneration. And I'm wondering what revolution looks like to you in 2021.
That's a long conversation that we're going to have to have over extended period of time. But revolution is a two-way exchange. And what do I mean by that? Like, we need to be very clear whether we like it or not. I'm just going to say this unequivocally, that us trying to break our chains will be met by those trying to keep us in change with severe and extreme violence. You're done with homework? You gotta let me finish this first. Yeah, I mean, look, the system is the way it is, not because it's democratic, but because it's actually the antithesis of that. And the second things really start to move in a democratic way, it will be met with hostility and it will be met with violence. Now, how do we organize ourselves to deal with those blows? I think there's a number of different ways. I don't think there is one way that totally defines how any community or group of people should resist. I'm one who firmly believes that it's going to take a multitude of tactics to be able to deal with this beast, right? And all the different things we have to find, the different strategies and tactics, we have to find complementary ways of working with each other to utilize our collective strengths, our collective brilliance, and our collective resolve, in order to overcome what's going on. I'm if many folks might talk about 1917 and all the lessons that are learned there, and there's stuff to learn there. But I'm one who's always said that a deeper understanding, ultimately, what it would take is actually best formed by studying the Haitian Revolution, right, which is often forgotten in this conversations about the great transformations of society, because that actually had a deeper dimension of abolition would be the framework that people use now, and emancipation than many other projects, because it had at its heart dealing with at the same time issues of race, issues of class, issues of gender, in a particular way that the other ones, since then, didn't in the exact same way. And I think that I'm bringing it up in terms of lessons because folks, one of the critical things that folks used there was their knowledge of the terrain in order to win those battles, knowledge of the terrain, knowledge of the season, and knowledge of their opponents, knowledge of their enemy that they use to their advantage. And I cite that because, if you were to look at the odds in 1791, when those Africans who were enslaved in Saint Domingue, when they started off on their quest, there would be no betting person in their right mind would have predicted the outcome that happened in 1804, right? You would have predicted everything but that to happen, right? But folks found a way. They created a way when they were outgunned, out-resourced, and they found a way through severe determination. And these are the things, the lessons I think that we have to really draw upon in the here and now, because it's not like, a major revolutionary mass movement that should one emerge in the United States will be playing on an even turf against the what's still the mightiest, most brutal, military force that's ever existed on the planet. And let's not kid ourselves that it's anything but that. Like in order to take that on, and eventually we will, like, how do we do that, right? What's the type of resolve, and how do you fight with that level of asymmetry? You can either look at it as something completely daunting, or you can look at it from a much more creative sense and say, I've seen other people who had far less do far more. How do I steal some of that magic? I think that's the kind of orientation that we need to be kind of drawing on, and the lessons we need to be building upon.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. The Haitian Revolution, existing under the crush of like 9 different empires, and and continuing to be very relevant if you pay a little closer attention to them. So next we had Dr. Tokar, and now, Mr. Tokar, I admonish you to frame your question not just about this hot pandemic issue, but bring back this revolutionary organizing framework, not just how can we make the pandemic issue under the purview of the radical left, but where is that going? I dare you. Take it, Brian.
Hey there. Well, I actually just had a root canal this afternoon, so I'm not thinking fast on my feet. I'm going to just paraphrase what I wrote, whether you like it or not, Hammy. I guess I'll start, though, by saying that I totally echo what you're saying, Kali, about the central importance of the land issue. Those of us who've been here in Vermont for a while know that the history of land speculation and the powers that be really running on land speculation here goes back to the 18th century. So it's crucially important to be talking about decommodifying land. I'm going to just paraphrase what I wrote. If you want to take it in a different direction, that's totally fine. But what I said is that I pointed out that early on in this pandemic, we're talking a year ago, there was a lot of talk about local mutual aid efforts being the leading edge of a broader political program. We're talking about dual power and community autonomy and how to really bring this together toward a more radical transition. It seems like the emergency nature of it all has really taken over the last year, and a lot of that edge has been lost. And I'm curious what possibilities you see for reasserting the really transformative potential of this period.
Whew. No, that's a damn good question. Let me state why from my view. Cooperation Jackson kind of took a crazy step last end of March, April, of trying to highlight the critical nature of this pandemic, and how in our view even then it was going to transform society, right? And that depending on what our collective response to it was, that it could either something that would bend in our direction towards liberation and transformation of society, or in the other direction, right? And just strengthen capital's hand. And in that context, we put out this call to start moving towards a general strike. And many people thought it was crazy and premature. I wouldn't, on normal senses, I wouldn't say that they were wrong. But we felt that we had to put it out, and that what emerged from that call is a coalition called the People's Strike, which still exists, still operating, still functioning. And it linked up with a lot of the spontaneous movement of workers that were already in motion in defense of their own lives in April and March. If folks remember, there were a lot of wildcat strikes in the poultry and food industries and a couple of other key industries that went on basically that kind of through June with some extending, but there was a hot period of April, May, June. As folks were fighting for overtime pay, hazard pay, more PPE. There were some very intense struggles there, and most of it was in places where there were no formal union organizing. So just really, a younger generation of activists on the floor, just fighting for the interests. Those who were now all of a sudden deemed essential workers, right? All these low wage, minimum wage workers who were now essential, working at the grocery stores and trucking and distribution, industries, etc. So we linked up with that and, tried to push that out. And it met with some pretty stiff resistance, from like a lot of the trade unions, being honest, and some other forces who, in the long run, we know would need to be allied to a call and push like this. And folks really, I think, being honest, just did not see the crisis for what it was. And I think many people were under the impression that this was something that was going to go away, within a couple of months, and that the first initial shutdowns, were going to deal with it, right? And I think that many on the left, and this is based on my engagement with folks trying to recruit them and come into this coalition, many on the left, I think, had this kind of assumption. And it was definitely, the state's response and capital's response was very clearly from day one, pushing kind of a herd immunity. They wouldn't, I give Trump and them credit for eventually just saying it, but that's what capital's, bottom line view was from the beginning, like get people back to work, because if they're not back to work and they're not consuming, we don't keep the cycle going, we don't keep things going. And never once did it really enter their political calculus at all that, they could stop everything, deal with a serious, public health crisis and alert, and just say, we're going to give, even if only for a brief moment, we're going to give, some form of universal basic income, to everybody, or to everybody within this class bracket. There's a number of different ways they could have did it, but, this would have ensured, a month or 2 months of really shutting everything down, following the path of what we saw work fairly successfully, say like, in New Zealand and in some other countries, where they just use, community principles, community self-care and broad education, and just be like, this is what we need to do to stop this, because there is no, we don't have a cure, and one is not immediately coming, but if we do X, Y, and Z, in terms of our behavior, we can shut this down. Didn't happen, because I think all the different sides were deeply embedded in kind of a capitalist logic and in a neoliberal logic and framework, which I think really undermined our efforts. Now, why I'm going that way? Because initially, there was a beautiful, in my view, a very beautiful response that gave me a lot of hope and restored some faith in American humanity. Mutual aid just exploded in a way I've never seen it in this country. Where there were millions and millions of folks who just got involved, in March, April, May, and we're just dedicating times, doing exchanges, putting in the work. That was beautiful, and that was something that should be built on. And we, Cooperation Jackson, started to do some elements of theorizing on that we called the build and fight formula, which tried just to kind of outline, like, here's some things that are actually being done that, if they could be connected, could actually build us and orient us towards moving towards dual power. because there were millions of people involved in mutual aid, not just tens of thousands or the couple of hundred we see in our community. Millions of people were involved in that. Imagine if that would have really been connected on a deeper level with a food sovereignty program, with a solidarity economy program, right? Where these are things that already exist, because there's community gardens and broader community gardens and almost everywhere throughout this country now. So if folks would have connected with each other and said, one of the limitations that we know that exists with a lot of some of the mutual aid work is that we have to get much of the primary supplies either by purchasing them or having them on stock or getting them donated, right? It's not based upon a productive exchange in the sense that we produce and then distribute based upon need, because that is how we know we could do it over and over again. And then the list of people who may have lost their jobs, may be put out of homes, to create, mutual relationships of productive capacity and exchange that we could build up that could totally re-articulate community production in our communities. So we were saying, let's try to politicize it in that sense of connecting it to these other segments of the work, which are community-driven, worker-driven, worker-owned, worker-controlled. That could be the fundamental basis of a program of transformation that we know is clearly available, where there's already millions of people engaged in doing that work. So not trying to come up with some speculative revolutionary subject, but saying, no, this already exists. People are already doing this. The struggle and the question is, how do we combine all those different forces, right? In a dialogue, and that's to us, we're saying, look, this is where forms like people's assemblies or popular assemblies, whatever you want to call them, these is where they come together, and they need to come together, to deal less with things like, is this the proper zoning for X, Y, and Z? But like, no, what is the actual concrete need in your community? Like, like now, like, okay, who's without water? Who's without food? Who's without adequate housing? How do we meet that? Either by finding and appropriating existing capacity, where it may exist. So that if you remember, doing a critical piece in the pandemic was in Los Angeles, New York, San Francisco. There was some damn good organizing and pressure that applied, where folks have won some actual victories of turning hotels and motels, turn them into shelters for folks who have been evicted or folks who were houseless, right? And saying that people, this capacity exists, open the damn thing up and let people use it. Like, that becomes the immediate expression of the type of people power that we could exert in a coordinated fashion, if we linked all these different things and then utilize our own democratic institutions. I'm not talking about this representative bourgeois democracy, our own democratic institutions to be able to mount campaigns of direct resistance, which we think is needed, going back to that just transition framework of where we started from. So, I think that there's a revolutionary practice that's embedded in all of this. I think our challenge is figuring out how to connect the dots. Like, that to me seems to be one of the greatest challenges that we have in the here and now. That I think, figuring that out seems to be in where the organic pieces, the organic intellectuals, if you want to call it that, the organizers who know all of these different points, who have, the connections and the relationships, or have the capacity and the know-how, the patience and the skill, the credibility, if you would, to be able to go on all these different places and say, all right, the folks who are producing food, you need to connect with the folks who are doing, the food giveaways, and let's figure out a real program so that, we can scale up with the labor that's in there to increase your capacity to grow food, and let's start producing for a need. How do we do that? Like, those type of conversations is what we need, in my view, like the people's assemblies and stuff like that to take on. And then that would be our revolutionary, the birth seeds of our revolutionary program.
Right.
Hope that helps. I mean, I can go on more. Hope that helps.
So it's like, a grassroots and grass tops. We got to get with all the folks that are doing the vital work on the front lines and all these different silos and connect them. And then, much like the Black Panthers 10-10-10 program, we got to organize people to organize people to organize people at the grassroots. I would like to, Kathleen is going to ask a really brilliant question, and I'm excited to hear it. First, Trevor has a really brilliant question, and I've seen it already, and I'm excited to hear it. Say it.
Hi. Yeah, thank you, Kali, for speaking tonight and for all the work you do. I hope you and your family can come join us here in the Eastern Woodlands. So I wanted to say first, I just love the conversation about mutual aid. I really feel, we need to get back to the roots. I'm a big Kropotkin fan, but more recently, William C. Anderson has been putting out some amazing articles, doing great work, great writing. So I wanted to hold that up. So my question was pertaining to forest gardening has been a lens that I've been looking at, but that's led me into looking more at forest health generally. But I feel like there's a possibility to transition from agriculture, like field culture, to silviculture. And that if we can use trees to for our staple foods and our fiber needs, and if we can use trees to meet our needs, that we can grow food and create this new economy, but at the same time provide habitat for the wildlife and that diversity that we also need. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts or see that as a possible future. Thanks.
You answered your own question, man. Yeah, I mean, most of what what you articulated, what I was saying earlier about in slightly different language about how do we become better stewards, and in the long term, I was just reading something, an article came out yesterday, and I've been seeing things about it the past couple of years, but California, much of the Midwest and much of the prairies now, the aquifers are damn near gone. Yeah, the topsoil is damn near gone. And they don't have any other method in order to try to do this except coming up with more techno fixes, this big notion that Elon Musk and them are promoting, we're gonna create these aquaponic, hydroponic farms out in the ocean, and grow all our food that way, and I'm a big science nerd. Anybody who knows me knows that, I'm a huge science fiction nerd, geek out on all that other kind of stuff. But I'm also with my man, why am I forgetting his name right now? Skipping me. Y'all might remember he did the Cosmos, the last Cosmos.
Sagan.
No, not Sagan, the student.
Oh, Neil
Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Yes, right.
And so Neil was asked about 2 or 3 years ago, one of my favorite political interviews I've heard. Somebody had asked him about what did he think about the colonization of Mars, right? And was he looking forward to it? And he said, basically, hell no, absolutely not. Right? And he said, the reason being, number one, if you're going to spend all that money and all those resources to go colonize something else, you can fix the shit that's wrong here. Right? But instead of focusing on fixing something, that's worked perfectly fine for billions of years here, rather than doing that, y'all are trying to figure out how to colonize, the moon and mine asteroids and comets, and it's like the mentality. He was just, it was a profound criticism, of so-called Western civilization. It was subtle, but it was very clearly there. But it goes back to this particular point: we rather do anything and everything than what the ecosystem actually already tells us works. Right? And what got us here in the first place. And rather than learning from, how life is dynamically evolved over the past, 4 billion years here, we, it's like, we just think we know better than what evolution has done. And that's just plain dumb. It's just wrong. So I think there's a critical way in which, I'm a big Amilcar Cabral fan. For those who never heard of him, look up some of his work. But there's one particular notion that he put out called Return to the Source. And I think what that program that you articulated is one of those critical things of returning to the source. See, hold on, just sit here with me. Because you know you hurt my back earlier. I'm really hurt. No. Just wait. It's something we'll do it together.
It's taking you so long.
Patience. It's not. I got 15 more minutes.
Okay.
So yeah, I think what is, it's convincing a lot of people that this is viable, and for that, I think we need to do some things. We need some practical examples. So in terms of us thinking about a just transition, could there be similar projects where some collectives come together in Vermont and they here and now and start, experimenting on that to a degree of community scale? I'm not talking about for a whole bunch of commodity, product and exchange, but for community exchange, which would take some time to cultivate. But let's see it in practice, and then just put it out there, and people, and allow people to gravitate towards it based upon the concrete practice.
Hell yes.
Yeah.
Um,
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm planting trees. I'm going to work on that practice. Thanks.
yeah. Come on up to the Grassroots Center and plant trees with us this spring. And we can talk some more about Amilcar Cabral. So Kali, my friend Kathleen is about to ask a question. She's an organizer of educators, and sorry, Kathleen, but is about to unveil an amazingly liberatory strategic plan for Vermont education. And so I just wanted to tease everybody with that before I let her ask her question. Go ahead, Kathleen. Thank you.
Well, I want to say I'm totally with you, Kali, on the decommodification and the enhancement of mutual aid. I think that's the direction we need to go. I also have great faith in Vermonters' ecological consciousness. I think we're like way ahead of the curve in terms of regenerative agriculture and a lot of this stuff. There's also a lot of equity work going on in the state. There's like lots of projects around equity in schools, racial justice, etc. And I'm really, really excited about Kenya's Everytown project and some of the other projects I'm trying to stay connected with around BIPOC land repatriation and redistribution. I think that's all very promising. At the same time now, I'm reading a little bit of Charles Blow, The Devil You Know, the Black Power Manifesto, and he's saying, hey, forget about the North and the Midwest. Black folks need to move back down south and create a power block. So they'll have political power, because like Ibram Kendi, I think, who I tend to agree with, says it's really difficult to change hearts and minds. What you just have to do is change policy and law and get it in place. So selfishly, I want this movement to Vermont. I want land redistribution, repatriation, rematriation, and a really diverse, multi-ethnic state. At the same time, I have to acknowledge that, some of our Black women leaders here have suffered racism in their communities and have been run out of their towns, and we haven't solved the racism problem here yet. There are still pockets, a lot of progressives, a lot of well-intentioned white liberals, but a lot of pockets of racism. So I guess my question is, what can we do to create inviting communities that are really there and ready to welcome and create a much more inclusive society here? What needs to happen?
Well, I think the Everytown project is a starting place. Just to my mind, and I haven't studied it enough, but I think to me, there would seem to be, and I'm not trying to talk out of turn, as we would say, but there would be kind of two phases of this. One, securing, the land trust holdings for the future.
Hmm.
It would be kind of a general thrust, but not necessarily with an expectation that folks would move into all those places immediately. And I say that based upon the reality that I know exists just in this country. Like racism is not a Vermont problem. That's just a U.S. problem. That's just it's in the DNA of this place, and it's going to take a whole rearticulation, the colonial set of practices and projects to uproot it, and that's going to take some time. Because it's not just you know um, people say bad things or people practice microaggressions. It's the very nature of how this whole thing is set up and why it's set up to begin with. Which is at the root of you know keeping the population divided and all the different types of payoffs that white supremacy has promised, which are coming short because the promise of America has always been to a certain extent that as long as like the European immigrants got down with the European ruling class on subjugating African labor on dispossession of indigenous people to the land, that they too could have a place within the project, within a kind of a little pecking order, but you would get the first fruits of what was done. They can't promise that no more. They really can't deliver on that no more, right?
Hmm.
And if once we understand that, then it's easy to understand why you get all these rabid fools out here following Trump and his in people like that. And if we just think that they all like stupid and not responding to both cultural anxiety, but more deeper still material, kind of angst, then we miss the prospect of being able to organize them on the things that we actually do share in common. So I'm not one who wants to surrender anything to the right. I'm just not that kind of person. And I believe that there's still a critical role that conscious white folks have to play in organizing non-conscious white folks. Like there's some particular groundwork that has to happen there, that has to be done, that y'all the best people situated to do that. And there has to be some long-term committed struggle to make that happen. But one thing I will say, Kathleen, I got some problems with Curtis in that book, the Devil You Know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because he accepts the framework for what it is.
Hmm.
And if you continue to accept the framework for what it is, it's going to keep producing the same results.
Mm.
Right? And at the end of the day, and trust me, the project that I'm involved in here with the Jackson Kush plan, like he stole from this plan in earlier iterations of it, but he removed the quest for self-determination from the plan.
Huh.
Right? And just saying, try to build power within what exists and just get the best that you can get from what exists, because it's ultimately saying revolution is not possible.
Huh.
Right? Transformation is not possible. The best you can hope for is to tinker with a few reforms here and there and get a few more crumbs for ourselves with like a group conscious and a group dynamic. That's not a project I accept.
Right.
Right? So our advocacy to me is, do we need to concentrate based upon the history of this place, Black people to be in one place to share cultural identity, security, and culture? Absolutely, no question about that. But if I accept his framework, right, and just trying to aggregate power in a way that something already exists, that then makes me a settler, right? Because it means I'm now become complicit in the genocidal theft of the land that's here and just trying to reap the benefits and rewards of it. I'm not trying to be different on a land which is not mine, and to come into a right relationship with it on the new terms, under new conditions. So I can't accept like this piece around let's just create some better set of policies and programs and then kind of force people, because that's ultimately what you're talking about, right? You force people into a new way of thinking, right? And if we follow that, you're going to get an even harder and faster fascist reaction than what's already here now. Because part of the big thing, if we really listen to people, and I'm here in Mississippi, so, fascism, if you want to call it that, like it's the folks here that live next door to me, and like not next door literally, but, that I'm surrounded by, they don't hide the beauty of their political actions. They don't hide their racist beliefs.
Right.
right? And I say the beauty of it because I know clearly what I'm dealing with, right? I know the terms of what I'm confronting. And then I know, hey, you either there's some space for me to try to make you a friend by changing your mind, or it's just we go, you know, when it comes time to it, we just gonna have to fight. Like it's very clear. There's not a lot of nuance, not a great, you know, and that helps with organizing quite a bit. Let me tell y'all, right? When you constantly trying to convince people that they are oppressed, you constantly kind of you have to go back and demonstrate little things over and over again to prove a point. Well, here in Mississippi, for the most part, people are like, I know I'm oppressed. You ain't telling me nothing new. The question is, what can I do about it? If you convince me of what can change, you know, but you ain't got to sell me on the fact that there's some people who mean me ill will, right? That's not here. But I think the piece that we need to is to disavow ourselves from certain notions that we can tinker with this thing and it's going to improve, right? There is no tinkering with capitalism, right? If you just tinker with it and you think that that's going to be enough, it'll just absorb that tinkering and allow that to strengthen itself,
Right.
right? Like it's pretty good, it's pretty dynamic the last 500 years of adjusting to our resistance and incorporating it and getting some of us to buy off and join in on the winning team. You know, if that's going to keep the system rolling, we got to stop that cycle, like one way or another. And I think being clear that a large part of what we're trying to do and struggling to do is really changing hearts and minds. And we do that, I think, best through practice, not through prescriptive law or this institutional framework, which then kind of gets back to codifying something that we put above us, the state, to do something, you know, like to hold us in check, as opposed to us holding each other in check, you know, and being accountable to each other, right? So I think there's some re-articulation of that we need to be clear upon. And to go back to the other part of your question, I think, again, like making the effort to decommodify the land, and in this case, make sure that it's reserved so that, you know, Black people, Indigenous people, Latinx people can come up and have access to it. And there's a gateway in the program that's there. But the other piece is then, how do you support, you know, the first initial concentrated effort of people moving and establishing communities that they can then branch out on? To me, those are the things that from afar that I would say, you know, I think works best from my experience. It may be different and people may have a different, you know, answer or explanation, but that's what I would offer, you know, based on what I know right now.
Well, let's hear a little bit more about that, because you keep on using this very interesting term, organizing. And the sort of arbitrary title of this evening's conversation is The Just Transition in Organizing and Education. And it's a split with an attempt to organize a very large organized body of frontliners, namely the high school population of the state of Vermont. But when you say organizing, you also were talking about liberals and progressives earlier. You know, there's a lot of people curating ideas and opinions and attitudes. But how can we, in our education and organizing, can we get some like formula understanding of what it means to actually organize this approach to scale, right? What does it mean to actually move people to move people? Or, you know, how would you frame that?
It's going to be a longer, don't lean on my, stand straight up, because you lean on my back, it hurts it even more. And I'm trying to stretch it so we can play in a minute, okay? But just stay here, just stay with me, just hold on tight. So I promised somebody that I would stop at like 8:30, 7:30. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to answer that question, and I got to make good on my promise, y'all, because he's got to go to bed pretty soon. So he holds up his end of the bargain. But I think that is something I would love to get in further for another time or talk, if folks are down with that. I know I will make the time to it. I will just say that one of the key things about organizing is, you know, that I would like to stress is building the relationships so we can know each other's real capacities and then find how we can move a program forward based upon the capacities that we have and strengthening those capacities. And what I mean by that is like, knowing what skills we have, right? And how can we mobilize those skills to meet certain needs in our community to build a deeper level of capacity and competency in our own community, but we don't have to rely on all these outside, kind of relationships. Not that you want to be exclusionary, but if we're going to really get towards the pieces and practice of decommodifying our reality, extending our capacities is one of the critical places that we have to start. And there's no way around it, I would argue. So we can build on that later. Sorry I have to leave you all, but so I'm gonna have to leave you all there for now.
Hi, T-Rex.
Thank you so much. What's up, T?
What's up, T-Rex?
All right. Well,
I
then,
love you.
everybody, thanks so much. Hit up our fundraiser if you can. And we will do a programmatic follow-up probably in April. So stay tuned. We'll get back to all y'all and we'll talk about what it really means to move some of this program forward. Kali, it's always wonderful to see your son T, and it was nice of him to bring you along. And we'll see more of you soon.
Thanks,
All right,
everyone.
y'all. Appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. Everybody, thanks.
All right.